All right. Let's dive into a fundamental part of RF engineering that honestly doesn't get the attention it deserves: radio wave polarization. We're going to zero in on the pretty unique advantages you get when you use a circular polarized wave.
Now, just so you know where we're at, this is part 10 of a big 20-part series. All the technical details we're covering come straight from a report on RF propagation by the folks at RFI Detectives, who are part of Virtualization Options LLC.
So here's the game plan for today. First, we'll talk about why polarization is such a big deal in the first place. Then, we'll get into what circular polarization is. After that, we'll see its killer feature against reflections, and finally, we'll look at where it's actually being used out there in the real world.
Okay, first up, the overlooked parameter. Look, we obsess over things like frequency, power, and bandwidth, right? But so often, it's polarization that quietly becomes the biggest problem in a system.
So, I've got to ask you, do you actually know how much signal you might be losing just because of polarization mismatch? This isn't just some academic question. It is a real, measurable issue that can absolutely destroy your performance, even when all your gear seems to be working perfectly.
And this is why it's so critical. A mismatch can quietly eat up 3 dB of your signal. That's literally half your power just gone. Or it could be 10 dB, which means 90% of your power vanishes. And in a perfect mismatch, the loss is theoretically infinite. These are huge numbers.
This chart really puts it into perspective. A 45-degree mismatch, something that can happen so easily just by how an antenna is oriented, boom, you've lost 3 dB. But a 90-degree mismatch, say trying to receive a horizontal signal with a vertical antenna, you could be looking at a devastating 20 to 40 dB of loss. The takeaway here is simple. This stuff really, really matters.
Okay, so now let's switch gears and get into circular polarization itself. We're going to see how you can build this complex, rotating wave from some surprisingly simple building blocks.
So what is it exactly? Well, unlike a linear wave where the electric field is just oscillating, up and down or side to side, with a circularly polarized wave, the field vector is actually spinning as it travels. Think of it like a corkscrew flying through space. It's a genuinely three-dimensional thing.
And how do you make one? The recipe is actually pretty cool. You just take 2 basic linear waves, one vertical and one horizontal. Make sure they have the same power, and then you knock one of them out of phase by 90 degrees. When you combine those two, that's what creates the spin. Now, that spin can go one of 2 ways, giving us 2 different, let's call them flavors. If the field is spinning clockwise as the wave comes toward you, that's right-hand circular polarization, or RHCP. If it's spinning counterclockwise, it's left-hand, LHCP. And this difference isn't just for kicks, it's the whole secret to its most powerful trick.
And that brings us to the reflection advantage. This is where we see how a basic law of physics gets turned into a powerful weapon against one of the biggest headaches in RF, multipath interference.
Circular polarization has this one truly amazing property when it comes to reflections. Seriously, it almost feels like a magic trick the first time you see it work.
And here it is. This is the big reveal. When a circularly polarized wave bounces off a surface, a building, the ground, whatever, its handedness flips. A right-hand wave becomes a left-hand wave.
Let's just walk through that. Imagine our transmitter sends out a right-hand circularly polarized signal. The wave that takes the direct path to the receiver gets there just as it was sent, as RHCP. No surprises there.
But what about the signal that bounces off the ground before it gets to the receiver? Well, that reflected signal is now left-hand circularly polarized. The reflection literally reversed its spin. So you now have 2 signals hitting your antenna, but they have opposite polarizations.
And here is where the magic happens. If your receiving antenna is designed specifically for RHCP signals, it will be almost completely blind to that reflected LHCP signal. It can basically just ignore the multipath noise. It's an incredibly slick way to clean up a signal in a messy environment.
Okay, so this is all great in theory, but where is it actually being used? For our last section, let's look at RHCP in practice, the real-world applications, and of course, the trade-offs. Well, you're looking at some of the most critical RF systems we rely on every day. GPS absolutely depends on RHCP to fight reflections off the ground and get an accurate fix. Same goes for satellite communications. And radar systems use it to filter out unwanted reflections, what they call clutter, from things like rain.
But, there's no free lunch in engineering. There are always trade-offs. The big advantage, obviously, is that amazing rejection of reflected signals. The downside? The antennas are definitely more complex to design, and yeah, it's a bit more forgiving of small alignment errors than linear, but you still need that polarization to match up really well, or you're going to see major loss. Plus, it can be vulnerable to things like heavy rain, which can mess with the signal.
So I want to leave you with this final thought. As our radio spectrum just gets more and more crowded and our environments get more complex, you have to wonder, is polarization, and especially a technique like RHCP, our most powerful, underutilized tool for making things work better? Based on what we've just seen, that's a question every single RF professional should be asking themselves. Thanks for joining me.